Hello, in this video, we'll look at token authentication in Kubernetes. You know that Kubernetes supports various types of authentication methods. One among them is the token-based approach where you use a token for a specific users to be authenticated with the kube-apiserver. Let's check how it is to be done in Kubernetes. So this is the scenario that we are going to use for this video. Let's say you want to configure a token-based authentication for the API server by passing a set of user details. Those details includes token, username, and the user ID details in a CSV file that will be passed on to the API server to be used for this authentication. Next, once we go to the terminal, the first step is to SSH to the control plane so that we can create the token list file inside this node. Okay. The next step is to create the actual token list file. Notice here we are trying to create the file at var temp. This path is important as we will be using this to configure inside the kube-api manifest file in the later part of this video. So we are creating a CSV file here. Next, let's configure some of the details for this file like sample token 1, the name is John, and the user ID is 100. So like this, we have a set of 4 values defined in this file. So what it means is that when we try to use a token like say sample token 4, then the API server is supposed to identify it as Jill and then keep using it for the next step in the RBAC. Once the file is created, let's try to print out the file so we can confirm the values still exist in the CSV file. Having validated it, then the next step is to go to the kube-apiserver manifest file and then update the token list file path. You'll be knowing that the manifest file for all the core components resides at HC Kubernetes manifest, or the kube-apiserver is at kube-apiserver.yaml file. This is the typical manifest file of the API server, where the core command that we need to look for is the kube-apiserver itself, and it contains a list of flags or parameters that defines this behavior. In most of the cases, we are going to have the authorization mode as RBAC, that again we are going to use for this particular authentication. So in our case, we have the token list file. So what we have to do is, we have to add it as one of the parameter to this kube-api server. Here we use --token-auth file as the flag, and the value is the path of the CSV file that we have created. Now, when this kube-api server is running as a pod, which means it needs to load this file within its own file system. So here we are mentioned as var/temp. This is not the same path as a host. This path refers to the current pod file system, which means we need to mount the file present in the host to this specific pod. So to do this, we will be using a volumes concept in Kubernetes. Here you can see the list of volume mounts available currently with kube-apiserver and list of all volumes. Of course, I have truncated it to make it easier. The next step is to configure the volumes and the volume mount. If you remember back, our path was var temp. This is referring to the host path. So once you add the volume as a token list, so this is going to be used and mounted into the pod file system. So here you can see the same name. And for simplicity, I have mounted to the same path, var/temp. Once you do this, then when you restart the kube-api server or when you save and exit, it gets restarted automatically. Then it picks the value present here and then start using it for the token-based authentication. Now when you do kubectl get pods and into the file system of kube system, which contains the kube-api server files, you can notice that we have the entry for the control plane's kube-api server and it is in the running state, which is good. And the most critical part here is the age that we need to take care of. Here you can see it is quite recent. It is like 50 seconds, which means the kube-api server has been restarted and it is in success state. So this completes the first major section where you have configured the token authentication file for the kube-api server. Next, let's test it out with a sample user and try to access one of the kube-apiserver's endpoints. To do this, we'll use a simple curl request where we try to access the default pods available in the default namespace. So here we have see the namespace as default and we are trying to access the pods. In order to use the token-based authentication, we need to use the authorization header. So for this, we are using dash header and we start with the authorization. It's going to be a bearer token followed by the actual token that we need to pass for this request. As you can see here, this is the same token that we have configured in the CSV file. What this means is that the API server is supposed to read this token and then identify that it is belonging to a specific user ID and then start using it going forward. However, when you execute this command, you see that the pod is forbidden. But a good thing is that it is able to identify that this token is part of the user John, which means the authentication has succeeded. So authentication is okay, but the authorization has not happened. The reason this happens is that authentication and authorization are two different parts. So first step is authentication has been done. Now this specific token has been identified as John. That's good. The next step is to go with the authorization. For authorization, we are going to use RBAC, the role-based access control. So basically, we'll be creating a role and a role binding for this specific user called John, and then start hitting to the same set of API endpoints here. Let's try that next. To do this, we need to first create a role. We name it as pod access, and we need to pass a two set of details. One is the verb. So basically, we are telling that I just want the get list and create access to the resource, namely pods. So these two are the critical parts when you are creating a role using the imperative command. Once you do this, the pod access role gets created. The next step is to create the corresponding role binding. What we basically do is for the same role called pod access. So this is referring to the same pod that we have created earlier. And then we are trying to bind it to the user called John. The name of the binding is given as pod access binding. Okay, so once we have created, now we have linked successfully about the John as the user to the specific role, namely where it has access to the list, create and get access for pods. Now when you try to hit the same set of URL where we try to access the default pods available in the default namespace, we get a result as a success, but the result is empty. That is still okay. Now you do not get the same authorization that error that we have seen earlier. Which means the first step of authentication is success and the second step of authorization is too success. The reason the items is empty is because currently we do not have any pods running in the default namespace. To quickly check, what we can do is we can simply create a simple pod. So in our case, I am just going to create a Nginx pod of the image Nginx. So now the pod is created. So now once the pod is created, now if you go and execute the same command, using the same curl command, trying to access the default paths. Now when you try to access the same API where it's trying to fetch the pods in the default namespace, then we need to get the specific details that we have seen earlier. Now the request has successfully executed and we have among the items list one Nginx pod. So this shows how you can use the token-based authentication. This shows how we can use token-based authentication in Kubernetes, where we have defined the CSV file containing the token details. Second, we have updated the API server. Third, we have created the role and role bindings. And finally, we have tested with a simple Nginx pod.